My aunt looked me in the eyes the day I came home and said, "You were never supposed to come back. You were supposed to disappear." And she meant it. Every single word. I know that now. I didn't know it then, not fully. When you've spent 3 years locked in a converted storage room in rural Kentucky, your brain does this thing where it holds on to the people who are supposed to love you. It protects you from the full truth of what they've done. It has to. Otherwise, you wouldn't survive. My name is Nora. I'm 31 years old. And the woman who orchestrated my disappearance wasn't a stranger. She wasn't some faceless predator from the internet. She was my Aunt Sylvie, my mother's younger sister, the woman who used to braid my hair when I was 9, who brought me a stuffed rabbit from a work trip to Portland when I was 12, who cried at my high school graduation like I was her own daughter. I want you to sit with that for a second before I tell you the rest. My mother died when I was 19. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by October. It was the kind of fast that doesn't let you prepare. One day she was at my college orientation, complaining about the parking. 7 months later, I was choosing a casket. She left behind a house in Lexington, a small savings account, and a life insurance policy worth $380,000 that named me as the sole beneficiary, but with one condition. I couldn't access the principal until I turned 25. Until then, a trustee managed it. That trustee was my Aunt Sylvie. My mother trusted her completely. They were close in that complicated way sisters sometimes are. Always on the phone, always in each other's business, always the first call in a crisis. I trusted her too by extension, and because I had no one else. My father left when I was 4. My grandparents on my mother's side were both gone. It was just me and Sylvie and whatever arrangement my mother had set up to keep me safe. For 3 years after my mother died, Sylvie played the role perfectly. She helped me find an apartment near campus. She co-signed my lease. She sent cards on my birthday. She called every Sunday. I graduated at 22, got a job at a small marketing firm in Louisville, and thought I was building something. Then I turned 23, and I started asking questions about the trust. Nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational. Just where do things stand? Can I see the statements? When exactly does the disbursement happen? Normal questions that any reasonable person would ask about money their deceased mother had set aside specifically for them. Sylvie's answers started getting slippery. It's complicated right now. The market's been rough. I'll have the accountant send something over next week. Next week became next month. Next month became after the holidays. After the holidays became I'll call you about this. Stop emailing me. I didn't understand what was happening. I told myself she was overwhelmed. Grieving, bad with paperwork. I made excuses for her the same way I'd made excuses for every person who'd ever let me down. Because that's what you do when you're 23 and alone and desperate for the family you have left to be safe. Then I came home one Friday evening in October and found 2 men in my apartment. I didn't even have time to scream. I won't describe every detail of what came after. Not because I can't. I've spent a long time in therapy learning to sit with those memories without drowning in them, but because that's not what this is about. What I'll tell you is this. I was moved twice in the first week. The second location was a property in a remote part of Harlan County, a converted outbuilding on land that had been in someone's family for decades. Someone connected to Sylvie through channels I wouldn't understand until much later. The man who managed the property was someone I'll call by what the other person there called him, just the caretaker. I never learned his real name. He wasn't cruel in an obvious way. He was indifferent, which is its own kind of cruelty. He brought food. He kept the heat running in winter. He answered no questions. For the first month, I was certain someone would come. My job would notice I was gone. My landlord would report something. A friend would call the police. I held on to that certainty like a rope. The rope frayed slowly. My firm thought I'd quit. I found this out later. I'd apparently sent a resignation email the week I disappeared. I hadn't. Someone had accessed my account. My landlord received notice that I was breaking my lease. My one close friend from college, a woman named Becca who lived in Cincinnati, texted me several times over the following weeks and received responses that were just coherent enough to make her think I was going through something and needed space. I know because she told me all of this afterward, crying in a way that made it clear she'd blamed herself every day since. None of it was her fault. It was a meticulous, patient operation, and the only person with both the motive and the access to pull it off was my Aunt Sylvie. She needed me gone before I turned 25, because by then I would have discovered that the trust was nearly empty. I don't know exactly when I stopped waiting to be rescued and started thinking about how to rescue myself. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was more like a slow tide going out, the hope of someone coming eventually draining away until what was left was something colder and more useful. Determination, maybe, or just survival instinct wearing a different coat. The caretaker was not a careful man in every way. He was careful about the locks, careful about the exterior, careful about keeping me from any window that faced the road. But he was not careful about what he left behind when he came and went. A newspaper once, a receipt another time, small things. I started cataloging everything I noticed, the way you do when your brain has nothing else to focus on. The newspaper told me the county. The receipt, a gas station about 12 miles out. I didn't have a plan yet. I just had information, and I held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile in both hands. My second winter there, the caretaker got sick. Not seriously, a bad flu, I think, but seriously enough that for 4 days his visits were shorter and more distracted. On the third day, he left his cell phone on the small table near the door. A burner, I thought. Old. He was gone before I could think clearly about what I was seeing. It took me until the next morning to work up the steadiness to do what I did, which was use it. I didn't call 911. I know that seems strange, but I'd had 3 years to think about what would happen if I called the wrong person at the wrong time. I didn't know who in that county might be connected to whoever owned this land. I didn't know how far Sylvie's reach went. What I knew was that if I made noise in the wrong direction, it would be the last noise I made for a long time. So I called Becca. She answered on the second ring. I had maybe 3 minutes before I needed to put the phone back. I told her I was alive. I told her the county. I told her the name on the gas station receipt. I told her to call the FBI, not the local police, the FBI, and to tell them this was connected to a trust fraud case in Fayette County, Kentucky, involving a woman named Sylvia Mercer. I told her not to tell anyone else, not her husband, not her mother, no one. Then I put the phone back exactly where it had been. The caretaker came back the next morning. He picked up the phone without looking at it and left. I sat in that room and shook for approximately 4 hours. What happened next took 6 weeks, and those 6 weeks were the longest of my life, in a different way than the years before them. Because now I knew something was in motion, and knowing something is in motion when you're still locked in a room is its own particular torture. Every sound outside could be rescue or discovery. Every delayed visit from the caretaker could mean he knew, or just that he was running late. I learned later what was happening on the other side of that wall. Becca had called the FBI field office in Louisville within an hour of my call. She was, apparently, exactly the kind of witness investigators want: calm, specific, organized. She'd kept every text message I had supposedly sent her over the 3 years I was gone. She handed over her phone. She gave them Sylvie's name and my mother's estate information. She told them about the trust. That thread, once pulled, unraveled fast. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit found what I had suspected but hadn't been able to confirm. The trust had been systematically drained over roughly 4 years through a series of transfers to shell accounts, expenses for trust management that were 3 to 4 times the legal limit, and one large transfer to a personal account belonging to my Aunt Sylvie's boyfriend, a man I had met exactly twice at family gatherings, who I remembered mostly as someone who laughed too loudly and always seemed to be watching the room. By the time I had disappeared, less than $40,000 remained of the original $380,000. Sylvie had needed me gone so that she could petition the court to declare me legally deceased. Kentucky law requires a minimum of 5 years before a missing person can be declared dead, but she'd apparently found an attorney willing to file a motion arguing exceptional circumstances. And once I was declared dead, she intended to dissolve the trust and absorb whatever remained. plus the equity on my mother's house, which she'd also quietly had transferred into a family LLC. She hadn't planned for Becker. She hadn't planned for me to hold on to that gas station receipt like it was a lifeline. She hadn't planned for me to survive 3 years with my wits intact and my memory sharp and my anger, God, my anger, still burning clean. They came on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd been keeping track by the caretaker's visits, and he always came fewer times on weekends. I heard vehicles outside, more than one, heavier than his truck. I heard voices. I heard the particular sound of a door being opened from the outside by people who know how to open doors. And then there was light, actual daylight, flooding in, and a woman in a jacket with letters on the back was kneeling down to my level and saying my name. She said it like a question and a statement at the same time, like she wanted to confirm but also like she already knew, like she'd been looking for me and was relieved to have found what she'd been looking for. Yes, I said. My voice was embarrassingly thin. I hadn't used it for real in a long time. She said, "We've got you. You're safe." I didn't cry. I'm not sure why. I think I'd gone somewhere past crying, somewhere that took months of therapy to come back from. I just nodded and let them help me stand and walked out of that room and into the gray Kentucky morning and stood in the cold air and breathed. Sylvie was arrested 4 days later at the house in Lexington she'd been living in for the past 2 years. My mother's house, the one that should have been part of my inheritance, the one she'd transferred into an LLC she controlled. Her boyfriend was arrested the same morning at his condo in Louisville. The caretaker was picked up 2 days after that. I was not there for any of the arrests. I was in a hospital in Lexington being assessed and fed and slowly, carefully reintroduced to the world at a pace that felt both too fast and impossibly slow. But I was told about them. The agent who'd found me, I'll call her Agent Reyes, which is close enough to her real name. She came to see me twice while I was in the hospital. She sat in a chair by my bed like she had all the time in the world and told me what they'd found, what they were charging, what the financial investigation had uncovered. The charges against Sylvie included wire fraud, theft by unlawful taking, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Her attorney had already begun floating the idea that she'd been manipulated by her boyfriend, that she hadn't known the extent of what he'd arranged for my disappearance. Agent Reyes told me this without editorializing, but the look on her face said everything about how that defense was likely to land. I asked Agent Reyes whether they thought Sylvie had really known what was happening to me during those 3 years, whether she'd known where I was. Agent Reyes looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "The emails suggest she did." I nodded. I'd already known the answer. I just needed to hear it confirmed out loud. The thing people don't tell you about surviving something like this is how long the paperwork lasts. The legal recovery of what remained of my mother's estate took 14 months. The civil suit ran parallel to the criminal proceedings and was frankly more exhausting because in a civil suit you have to be deposed, and being deposed means sitting across a table from attorneys who are paid to make you doubt your own memory, your own timeline, your own experience. I had a good attorney. Her name is not something I'll share because she deserves her privacy, but she was sharp and patient, and she'd handled trust fraud cases before. She told me on our first meeting that she expected we would recover between $180,000 and $240,000 after penalties, legal fees, and whatever assets could be seized from Sylvie and her boyfriend. She was right. We ended up at $211,000 plus the return of my mother's house, which I later sold. It's not $380,000. It will never be $380,000. Some of that money is simply gone, spent, hidden in accounts they couldn't fully trace, dissolved into a lifestyle that left no clean paper trail. And there are days when I feel the grief of that very specifically, when it's not even about the money, but about what the money represented, which is the last thing my mother was able to give me, the provision she'd made from her deathbed to make sure I would be okay, and what Sylvie had done to it. Those days are harder than I usually let on. Sylvie pleaded guilty 14 months after her arrest. She received 8 years in federal prison on the fraud charges and an additional 4 to run consecutively on the conspiracy charge. Her boyfriend received 12 years. The caretaker who covered it extensively with prosecutors received a reduced sentence of 18 months plus probation. I was not required to speak at sentencing. I chose to. I kept it short. I'd written something much longer, but I cut it down over several drafts until what was left was the only thing I actually needed to say, which was this: my mother trusted you with everything she had left to give me. That trust was the last act of love of her life. What you did with it is something you'll have to carry in whatever way you're capable of carrying things. I'm not interested in watching you carry it. I'm done watching you. Then I sat down. Sylvie didn't look at me once during the proceedings, not once. I don't know what I expected from her. Some acknowledgement, maybe, some moment of recognition that I was a person she had once loved, or at least pretended to love. But she looked at her attorney, and she looked at the judge, and she looked at her hands, and she never looked at me. That actually made it easier. By the time I walked out of that courtroom, I was done. I live in Nashville now. I have an apartment I chose myself. Furniture I bought myself, a job in content strategy at a company where no one knows this story unless I've chosen to tell them. I have a therapist I see every other week. I have Becca, who flew down the month I moved here and spent a weekend helping me set up my kitchen and crying intermittently and apologizing for the text she hadn't questioned, and who I told very firmly was not allowed to apologize anymore. I have a small planter on my windowsill with herbs I'm attempting to keep alive with mixed success. I have a coffee shop 2 blocks away where they know my order. I have mornings that are ordinary and unremarkable and mine. Some days I think about the room in Harlan County. I think about the particular quality of the light that came through the one small window that faced the wrong direction. I think about the way I used to count things to stay grounded: ceiling tiles, floorboards, the number of times per day I heard a bird outside. I think about the version of myself that held onto that gas station receipt. I want to tell her she was right to hold on. I want to tell her that the counting was worth it, that the patience was worth it, that surviving in the particular quiet and deliberate way she survived was the right choice, even when it didn't feel like a choice at all. I can't go back and tell her. But I can tell you, whatever room you're in, whatever situation has locked you in and thrown away the key, the thing that will get you out is not a miracle. It's not someone sweeping in at the right moment. It's you paying attention, you noticing the receipt on the table, you making the call in the 3 minutes you have. You already know what you need to survive. You've known it longer than you realize. My aunt told me I was never supposed to come back. She was wrong about a lot of things, but she was especially wrong about that. I've thought a lot about why things unfolded the way they did, not in a mystical way. I don't believe the universe was watching out for me or that some invisible force was keeping score. But I do believe that choices accumulate. Every decision a person makes, good or careless or cruel, builds towards something, and eventually the thing it builds toward arrives. Sylvie made choices for years. Small ones at first, I imagine, borrowing from the trust in ways she told herself she'd correct later, convincing herself the money was practically hers anyway, that my mother would have wanted her taken care of. That's how it starts with people like her. Not with a dramatic turn toward evil, but with a series of small justifications, each one making the next one easier. By the time she arranged for me to disappear, she'd already crossed so many lines that one more probably didn't feel like much. That's what happens when you let yourself get away with things. Your own conscience stops being useful. And then there's what happened to her because of those choices. 8 years plus 4 more in federal prison, her boyfriend sitting in a cell in Louisville. The house that was supposed to be hers returned to me. The accounts she thought were untouchable, frozen, and picked apart by people who are very good at following money. Every careful thing she'd built over those years dismantled in about 6 weeks of federal investigation. Not because the universe balanced the scales, but because fraud leaves trails and trails get followed, and the people who think they've covered everything almost never have. I think about the 3 years I spent in that room. I think about the version of myself that was terrified and lonely and sometimes genuinely unsure whether survival was worth the effort. And I think about the specific unglamorous things that kept me going. Counting floorboards, noticing what the caretaker left behind, staying sharp when every part of me wanted to go numb. That wasn't courage in the dramatic sense. It was just the decision made over and over again on ordinary days to keep paying attention, to refuse to let my mind go somewhere it couldn't come back from. That's the thing about resilience that nobody explains clearly enough. It doesn't feel like strength while you're in it. It feels like stubbornness. It feels like refusing to lie down, not because you're brave, but because something in you just won't. And then one day you're on the other side of it and you realize that the stubbornness was the whole thing. That was it. That was what saved you. Becca saved me too, in a different way. She picked up on the second ring. She listened without panicking. She did exactly what I asked without adding her own fear to the situation. I've told her since that she was the calmest person in a crisis I've ever known, and she laughed and said she was absolutely not calm. She just waited until she hung up to fall apart. That's its own kind of integrity. Doing the right thing first, processing later. What I want people to take from Nora's story, from my story, is not that things always work out. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the people who deserve justice don't get it, and sometimes the people who deserve to be safe aren't. I know that. But I also know that staying sharp, staying honest, refusing to become what was done to you, those things matter regardless of the outcome. They're the only things fully in your control. Sylvie bet that I would break. She was wrong. That's the whole story, really.